For the next part of this presentation, we're going to talk about the OT lens within sensory processing. The goal of this next session is for all of us to gain a sensory lens for both ourselves and for our clients. When I say sensory lens, this means seeing and understanding the world through the filter of our sensory experiences. Bringing awareness to how our senses are impacting our daily life, our emotions, our thoughts, and our well being. And I know as I've been an intern at the family place, I feel like I've gained a lot of different lenses on ways that I can view my future clients. And I'm so, so grateful for that. And likewise, I just want to leave sharing some information about a lens that we use very frequently within OT practice. To start out here, I want to have us each consider our own sensory preferences. I'm going to go through several examples here, and I want you to take a second and consider which preference you relate most to. The situation we'll have here is that we're all trying to work at a coffee shop that has a lot of background noise going on. Are you the type of person who doesn't even notice the conversations going around you? Or do you create noise to go along with that? Do you turn up music or tap or click or hum or whistle if there's any music in the background? Are you extremely bothered by the noise, but you don't do anything about it? Or do you put on noise canceling headphones because you don't want to hear anything? You don't like that background noise. And the next one we're going to talk about is movement preferences. The first example for this, we're talking about if we are at an amusement park and there's a huge roller coaster similar to this one. Do you go on that ride and you don't think it's that exciting? You're not phased? Do you go on the ride and you love the thrill of the turns and the twists and the drops? You go on the ride but get motion sick from all the movement? Or do you just choose not to go on the ride because it's too much movement for you? Go ahead and think about which one of these you resonate the most with. And for the last example here, we're talking about going grocery shopping. As you know, at the grocery store, it's very bright, lots of sensory input. You've got lights going on, you've got lots of colors, lots of signs all over. You're not bothered by any of that? Maybe you're missing a sale sign. Maybe you just are not noticing all of the noise around you. Do you like those bright colors and the lights and the music, and you're looking at a variety of items? Maybe you're picking things off the shelves. You love just the being curious and looking at everything around you. Or do you go grocery shopping even though the colors, lights, and music bother you? Or do you just avoid going to the store altogether because it's overwhelming and you say, I'm going to order my groceries online? Go ahead and think about which one resonates the most with you. Okay, as we've gone through these activities, you probably have maybe thought about people who are different from you with their preferences. And I know for me, I have very distinct preferences, and I have a very distinct way that I like my movement or my sound or visual sensory input. And each of us have a preference. And so the point with these three examples is that each of us have unique sensory preferences and needs, and we all can get overwhelmed at certain times by sensory input, and that bar in which we're getting overwhelmed is different for each of us. Likewise with this example, I'm going to just read through some of these sensory input scenarios, and then you can just give a thumbs up, thumbs sideways, or thumbs down, depending on if you agree with the statement, you're so, or you disagree. Do you like to go barefoot? Are you bothered by particular food textures? Do you like to go to places that have bright lights and that are colorful? Are you bothered by unsteady or fast moving visual images in movies or TV? Are you distracted if there's a lot of noise around you? Do you like strong tasting mints or candies? Do you leave or move to another section of the store if you smell strong odors? And do you like how it feels to move about, such as dancing or running? And so, hopefully, you see here your sensory preferences, and maybe you can think of other people who have different sensory preferences than you. This idea is just reiterating that each of us have a preference for the way we like sensory information. And so we experience the world through our senses, and how we sense things affects our daily routines. And Winnie Dunn is an occupational therapist, and so she said sensory processing describes how individuals experience the world through their senses and how they regulate their behavior responses associated with that sensory information. And so sensory processing happens with every single one of our senses. And so you might have heard of touch, sight, sound, taste, and smell, but we also have proprioception, which is movement, vestibular sense, which is our balance and our orientation in space, and then interoception, which is the physical condition of the body. So maybe how hungry we are, if we need to go to the bathroom, things like that. And so, sensory processing is the ability of the nervous system to take information from the environment, organize it, and then interact with our environment effectively. And so there are patterns to the way that we process senses and in the amount of sensory input that we prefer. And we're going to talk about Winnie Dunn's model of sensory processing. This is something we focus a lot on in occupational therapy. And there are four different categories, and we're going to go through each of these in detail. There's bystanders, seekers, sensors, and avoiders. And each of these have distinct characteristics that accompany them. And so I also just want to say, as a caveat here, we never want to label someone with one of these titles. These are patterns of processing. They're not labels that we put on people or anything like that. They're very strengths based, and when we understand someone's strengths, then we can adjust their environment accordingly to help have the environment align with their sensory needs. And so, I also want to say we can have a different sensory processing style for each sense. Maybe someone is a bystander in the way that they process sound, but then they're a seeker for visual input. And so we'll go ahead and go to the next slide here, and we're going to dive deep into each of these categories. Okay, so here is a chart with the processing patterns. I don't want us to get too overwhelmed or anything. I know when I first saw this chart, I was like, what is going on? There's a lot happening here. I first just want to talk about the two parts of this model. So there's a detection threshold or a neurological threshold, and there's also a regulation strategy. And so when I say threshold, this just means how fast is your brain sense something? How fast does your brain respond to a sensation, or, recognize that there's something in the environment? And so a low threshold means that you recognize everything around you. You doesn't take much, you got that low threshold. And a high threshold means that it takes a lot for you to notice something in your environment. It's maybe you don't notice something going on, like if there's a song in the background, maybe you just don't hear it as much. But a low threshold means, you recognize that song absolutely instantly once it starts playing. And then regulation strategy, it describes how you respond to those sensations. Do you actively do things to control that input, or do you let things happen and then you react to it rather than trying to actively control the environment? And so we're going to go through each of these sections here, but I like this chart because it talks about the thresholds and that neurological component there, as well as the regulation style that you have associated after you're having that sensation. And so the goal here is that we want to balance with being overloaded and being inattentive to things. We don't want to be too we don't have too many sensations for our preference, because then we can become overloaded. But we also need enough sensory input within our environment to be aware and attentive. And that's that good green zone. If we can have a good amount of sensory input that's not overwhelming, but that also is enough to get us to notice, then we're able to learn and focus and be aware and attentive. And so Sorry, excuse me. I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but understanding our own sensory preferences and our own thresholds can help us with regulating our emotions because when our senses are in line and when we're able to be, learning and aware of our surroundings, then we can regulate our emotions a little bit better if our sensory needs are being met, is what I'm trying to say. And so, um, one more thing about those thresholds, we can think of them kind of like a cup. And some of us, like me included, have a very small sensory threshold cup. We have a very, very much low threshold. It doesn't take much to fill that cup or to get overwhelmed by too many senses. And so that's a low threshold. If you have too much sensory input, you can become overstimulated and then it gets really, really hard to regulate your emotions. And then other people, they have very large cups. It takes a lot of sensory input for them to even notice something. And if there's not enough sensory input in that cup, it might mean that they're missing things within their environment. They're not noticing a lot of things. And so we're now going to go through the next couple of slides and we're going to dive specifically into each of these categories. Okay, we're first going to talk about bystanders. And so we see here that bystanders have a high threshold, which means it takes a lot for them to notice information, and they have a passive self-regulation style. So they're not trying to seek out any sensory input. They're low registration is what we call it. They're not noticing as much in their environment, and they're not doing anything to try and add more sensory input to that environment. And so some of those examples that we mentioned earlier included bystanders type of processing patterns. So maybe you don't notice the conversations going on around you, or you go on a roller coaster ride. It didn't even phase you, it wasn't that exciting. Or if you're at the grocery store and it's loud with lots of bright lights, you're not really bothered by it, but you also might miss a sale sign here. And so these individuals are taking longer to or more input to notice sensory information. They're very easygoing. But they're also more likely to miss information and they can appear uninterested or inattentive at times. And so maybe they don't notice their name being called, or they don't notice someone entering a room, or they're wearing their shoes on the wrong feet and they don't even know it. And again, this isn't a weakness, this is just a processing style. And so to support individuals who are bystanders, we can add more sensory input into their environment. Maybe they need things displayed visually in order to recognize things. Maybe auditory approach isn't the best for them. They need things written out very clearly, or having different types of sensory input within their environment. A seeker is similar to a bystander in that there's a high threshold. It takes a lot for them to notice a sensation, but they want more of it. They're looking to fill their environment with as much sensory input as they can. And so, thinking back to those examples earlier, this might be someone who in a coffee shop is turning up the music. They're tapping, they're clicking, they're humming, they're whistling along. Maybe they're at an amusement park, they go on a ride and they love that sensation, or they love the bright colors at the grocery store, things like that. And so the brain is wanting more sensation. These are the kiddos maybe that are hopping instead of walking. They're seeking out sensory experiences. And for them to be in an attentive or a state where they can learn or be focused, maybe they need to be fidgeting, they need to make noises, they need to be chewing on things, preferring colorful, bright, or loud environments, things like that. And this can be with adults too. I know for me, sometimes if I'm coloring on something or, doing a side task, I actually have better focus. And so with these individuals, they're very curious, and we can support seekers by implementing more sensory input into their environment. And by that, it just depends on what their senses are. Like we can be very cognizant of behavior, but maybe more movement breaks are needed. Maybe putting music on in the background can help with study tasks, things like that. Next, we'll talk about a sensor. And so this individual is similar to a bystander, and they don't do anything to try and change their environment necessarily. However, this individual has a very low threshold. They notice everything that happens. They're very observant. They can notice exactly if someone enters a room, or like on this side here, we can draw back to those examples. They're bothered by the noise around them, but they're not going to do anything. They go on the ride, but they're getting motion sick from the movement. And they go to the grocery store, even though the colors and the lights and the music is bothering them. And so they're detecting all this sensory information, but they're not actively attempting to disengage with it. And so this feeling of being overwhelmed by all the sensory input can be very overwhelming. But like a strength of these individuals is that they're very attuned with their environment and the people around them. They can detect all of the things that are occurring. They're very observant. And to support sensors within environments, we can try and remove whatever sensory information is being overwhelming to them. Maybe it's dimming the lights, it's turning off the music, it's giving them some alone time, it's helping them understand what their sensory preferences are and being able to verbalize that and advocate for their sensory needs. An avoider, on the other hand, is going to be similar in that they're noticing lots of their sensations. Like they're similar to this sensor in that they recognize senses very quickly with their low threshold, but an avoider is going to take a very active self regulation approach. This is someone who's maybe running away when they are overwhelmed by a certain sense, or covering their ears, or actively trying to turn off lights in their environment, or take away those senses that are less preferable to them. And so, from our examples before, yeah, we talked about noise canceling headphones, or choosing not to go on a roller coaster ride because it's too much movement, avoiding going to the store altogether. Just thinking about that avoiding tendency. They're avoiding all of those things with those sensations that are overwhelming to them. And so, to support people in this environment, likewise with the sensors, it's really getting to know their sensory preferences and honoring that, and giving them the tools they need to help avoid those senses, whether it's those noise canceling headphones and things like that. And so I really want to connect this sensory processing concept with the children and adults that we are serving at the family place, because trauma greatly impacts those sensory processing styles and preferences. And those who have experienced neglect or prolonged states of fight or flight can either misinterpret or underreact to important sensory information. And so these everyday situations might be misinterpreted, and result in aggression or shutting down if the individual is overwhelmed or running away. And so, sensory interventions have been shown to enhance emotional and physiological self regulation in clients with trauma backgrounds and/or mental health diagnoses. And so, again, I just want to reiterate here, everyone has a sensory preference, but when trauma occurs, those sensory preferences can be magnified, and that response to sensory input can be um, very, very sensitive, and it can be greater than maybe someone who hasn't experienced trauma. And so, again, with finding that balance between when we're able to be focused and attentive and being overwhelmed by sensory information, there might be a little bit more narrow of a window there, because an individual could be very overwhelmed by sensory input that might not overwhelm someone else. And so, going along with the ARC model and the sensory processing and how it fits in, Margaret Blaustein said our role is to help give kids agency over their regulation experiences. And so, when individuals are understanding of their own sensory preferences and needs, it can help them verbalize what they're needing to do to meet their sensory needs, and therefore they can be better able to regulate emotionally. And so the bottom line with all of this is that sensory preferences and sensory experiences are foundational to self regulation. And so when we understand our sensory preferences, we can help with developing strategies to support us in navigating and coping with sensory challenges. And we, once we understand our thresholds and our approaches to sensory input, we can better verbalize what our needs are, and we can better understand where we're at with our energy levels and with our regulation. And so, sensory information is a foundation for that emotional experience and that emotional regulation as well. And when sensory input is well regulated, it can contribute to a more stable emotional state, which allows for better emotional regulation. And so, challenges with this self regulation, such as sensory overload, can disrupt emotion regulation as well and lead to difficulties in effectively managing and modulating emotions. And so, this example for me, is very, very clear. I know in my life when I have had a really long day and maybe my sensory cup, my threshold is just overflowing. If I come home and maybe the lights are too bright for me and I'm having a lot of sensory input, everyone's trying to talk to me at once, or lots is happening, I can get very overwhelmed. It's very hard for me to regulate my emotions if I'm feeling like my sensory needs are not being met. But if I can dim the lights a little bit, get into a space by myself, like away from all of the noise, then it's easier for me to manage and modulate. And another example of this is, I know one experience I had, I was at horse group just a couple weeks ago with the family place, and I had gotten a bunch of sand just in my shoes. And I was getting home and I was trying to, just talk about what we wanted for dinner. And I just was feeling so, so agitated. And then I was just, doing a little check in, and I was like, okay, I am feeling sand in my toes. And once I was able to get that taken care of, I felt like I was at a very much better space to try and, take steps moving forward. And I was able to regulate my emotions a lot better. And so, this just goes to say, when we understand our sensory preferences and our sensory experiences, we can better understand what we need to regulate. And so, if there's one thing that we walk away with today, it's that meeting our sensory needs can be a foundation for emotional regulation. And so, furthermore, when we understand those sensory processing patterns, we can have better sensory regulation and therefore emotional regulation. And so, you see here, like there's a little house on the top. And so, the foundation for that emotional regulation is sensory experiences and having those sensory needs met. And so, whether we have a bystander, processing pattern, avoidant, sensing, or seeking pattern, when those preferences are met, it lays a foundation for managing those emotional experiences. So, in occupational therapy, we're going back to that lens we talked about. There are several ways that we can meet the needs of individuals with very strong sensory preferences. And so, we only are providing intervention when a sensory pattern is interfering with daily life. None of those processing patterns are wrong, but they can cause barriers if the sensory needs are not being met. And so, one of the things we do is we teach people how to identify their sensory processing style, and this can lead towards their regulation. And then, likewise, we can adjust the environment or adjust the task to meet their needs. And so, we consider the sensory demands of the activity as well as the environmental sensory factors that could be affecting participation. And so, for example, in the environment, we can implement coping mechanisms like noise canceling headphones, putting on sunglasses inside, or having a visual schedule to help someone follow along a little bit better. Or but we can also adjust the task. We can add in visual or verbal cues, especially for those who might be needing more sensory input. And so, an example of this would be a red light or green light cards when having transitions of like cleaning up toys. Okay, let's have red light, or stopping this activity, and then transitioning and saying, okay, green light, now it's go time for this activity. And so, just a simple example like that, adding in color to, or like a specific card set to an activity, can help with increasing sensory input. But the summary of this slide is really each person has a sensory preference, and it's all about understanding that preference and adjusting the environment or the task accordingly. And so, understanding sensory preferences can allow us as practitioners to know the types of sensory input that bring comfort and regulation. And so, one question that we can ask both ourselves and the clients we're working with are these persons' sensory needs being met? And so with that, we can think about what can we reduce or add in their environment? Do they need more sensory input? Are they needing like a movement break or music or white noise? Or are they needing less sensory input, like dimming the lights, reducing noise, providing space or alone time? And we can also ask ourselves what activities would help them become more regulated by meeting their sensory needs. Are there calming sensory activities or music or fidget toys, things like that? And it's truly just a journey of sensory exploration as well. What things work for individuals and giving them the time and the space to explore that and see what is working for them. And Judd, who is a therapist at the family place, designed these worksheets here, sensory activities for emotion regulation. And there's so many great activities on here. And it's truly a matter of finding what works for the client or for ourselves if we're thinking about this in our own life. There are many things that can be calming sensory activities, and there's some great examples of that on this list as well. And so it's a matter of finding what works for the individual. And so lastly, I am leaving this will be made into a resource. I'll have it sent out to everyone. I'm leaving it here, and it's about the four sensory processing patterns, and it gives a strength for each style as well as a barrier and then supports within the environment. And so we talked a little bit about this already, but as a review, the bystanders are not noticing as much in the environment. They're easygoing in nature, but they could appear uninterested or inattentive, and some supports for these individuals, or if they're experiencing this processing pattern with a sense, could be adding sensory input to their environment, maybe incorporating more sensory experiences, or providing information in multiple ways. And likewise with seekers, they have a very high threshold. And so they're seeking for more information, though, so different from bystanders. And they're curious, they might appear hyperactive or busy. And so adding sensory input to these tasks, just like with the bystanders, but maybe they're wanting more of certain sensations, whether they're needing a fidget toy, bright colors, music, movement breaks. And providing new ways for performing tasks is also a great strategy for individuals who have this processing pattern. And so, moving down to sensors, that red category here, a strength of these individuals is awareness, but they might be overwhelmed easily by sensory information. And so, we can reduce sensory input in their environment and provide education on stress management and boundaries as well, and understanding that sensory preference. And so, honoring their preferences as well is a great way to support these individuals. And so, maybe they prefer a very well organized environment, or they have specific food preferences or clothing preferences. And then for the last category, we have those who are sensation avoiding, and so they're overwhelmed easily by that sensory input, and they actively try to change their environment to avoid things. And so they actively demonstrate their needs, though, because communication is behavior. And when they're trying to avoid certain sensations, they're communicating that. And so they might miss out on experiences due to that avoiding nature. But to support them, we can reduce sensory input in the environment, whether it's lights or noise. And likewise, we can honor their preferences, whether they need noise canceling headphones or quiet spaces for alone time. And this concludes the presentation. And I just have acknowledgments here and want to thank all of the people who have supported me in the creation of these slides. And there are some references here following that QR code. And feel free to reach out to me. I am always happy to answer any questions. And I just want to say again, I am currently still a student, and I'm not currently a licensed occupational therapy practitioner. And I hopefully will be. I will graduate in May, but take all of the things I said here, knowing that I am a student, but I would be happy to answer any further questions that anyone may have. Thank you so much.